Mr. Santoyo.
Good afternoon. I appreciate the opportunity to come and talk to you. Appreciate the work that Councilmember Fiorini has put together. I'm really encouraged with the whole fact that this council is looking into storage and hopefully will be sending out a strong message in terms of its importance. Now, my discussion will be different than the prior speaker because I'm not going to be talking hypothetical. I'm going to be talking actual. Okay. And I say that from the perspective that I've got 30-some years of actually operating large reservoirs under all conditions, whether they're in the 1977s during basically the driest years in California, or they're in the 1983s when they're the wettest, or in the 1997s when we had the 100-year floods. I've operated reservoirs throughout that period. So I'm going to tell you the reality. First of all, before I get into that, I do want to spend a little bit of time giving some background in terms of the area that I've been principally responsible for. And I really thought that question earlier regarding subsidence in the Central Valley was a key question because I represent the Bryant Division. Bryant Division, as you might know, it was the cornerstone for the Central Valley project. It was the first project that came into California under federal process in order to effectively stop subsidence in the Central Valley, because it was because of groundwater overdrafting that resulted in the subsidence. The purpose, primary mission for the Bryant Division was to conduct conjunctive water use. In other words, bring in surface water in order for farmers to use that in lieu of groundwater, but at the same time recharge the groundwater so that you could bring back the water tables back to where they should be and to stabilize those groundwater tables. So to achieve that, requires both water, surface water that can not only meet the demands of the municipalities that we deliver water to, including the city of Fresno, but also to meet the demand of the farmers that grow the widest variety of crops in this nation. In fact, we represent those counties that are 1, 2, and 3 highest production ag counties in the nation. So the area I represent is pretty important to the state of California. We represent about a $5 to $6 billion economy to the state of California. However, we have had challenges, and they've been principally revolving around storage. We, as you might know, in recent years entered into a settlement on the San Joaquin River, which there's been a reallocation of approximately 200,000 acre feet, or about 20% of our water supply, our reliable water supply, to restore the San Joaquin River and bring back a salmon run, which from a societal perspective is a good thing. However, you've got to keep in mind there's a price to pay when you do that. Because for the cities that depended on that water for delivery to meet their constituents, for the farmers that needed that water to maintain their ag production, that meant a change. And so with that caused us to go back and figure out how can we manage the existing water supply that we have so as to try to accomplish those goals. The challenge we have, though, is that we have a really small reservoir. It's only 500,000 acre feet, okay, for an annual runoff of approximately 1.8 million acre feet. Those numbers don't match. So what that means is that this reservoir has to turn over 3-4 times in order to try to manage that flow. It does not do it effectively. We lose on average about 450,000 acre feet per year. Almost one full reservoir is lost to flood releases. Okay, over the past 30 years, we've lost over 14 million acre feet to flood release, which does not do anybody any good. I don't care what the arguments are. I mean, I've lived it, I've operated it, and basically it boils down to is that when it comes down, it's roaring. It's not coming down slowly, it roars. And so you let it out as fast as you can, and it goes to the delta. And when it reaches the delta, remember, in a wet year, it's not just only our tributaries sending water into that delta. All tributaries are sending water into that delta, and that's putting pressure on your levees. That's one of the reasons that you guys are trying to figure out how to solve the problem. So the fact is for us is that in order to reduce flood releases and try to convert those over back to usable yields, we needed to look at a reservoir that could accomplish that, an in-stream reservoir that could be built within the footprint of the existing reservoir. That's where Temperance Flats comes into play. I think from the perspective that, you re-evaluate a lot of small reservoirs, I think that's wonderful, okay? But I will tell you, because I've been involved in the full studies of this, there are a number of operational issues that make small reservoirs unfunctional. We don't have time to go through all of that, but if they were viable, I guarantee you we would have been doing it 20, 30 years ago. So what I'm telling you is that it's taken 10 plus years of hard studies to get to where we're at today. The discussion that was discussed with the prior speaker, high elevation reservoirs, I don't know where, but certainly not in our reservoir, because we happen to be one of those reservoirs that has Southern California Edison that uses that river in a series of hydro projects that we have no control, no operational control over how they do that. They operate it to maintain power generation in Southern California. Pacific Gas and Electric has an additional couple of reservoirs, same purpose. So the only thing we have is a little tiny reservoir at the end of the stream that somehow we have to manage water that roars down there. So you can build all the little reservoirs in the high elevations you want. Does absolutely nothing for anybody. Not in ours, in our case. If we don't look hard at actually creating a serious in-stream reservoir, we got serious problems that we're not going to be able to overcome, and we are back to pre-project days because we can no longer provide that recharge water into the ground. So we're counting our days in terms of when we'll be back to such a serious situation that Californians will have a real problem.
How do you react to Mr. Fiorini's suggestion that local interests pay half share of cost of new storage?
Oh, absolutely. If we look at Chapter 8 in the water bond, and my experience is this, is that I worked closely with Governor Schwarzenegger, his people, and Senator Feinstein, and Senator Ana Caballero and Senator Cogdill in formulating Chapter 8 and the conditions in which that
is Chapter 8 of the bond issue now?
Yes, that's correct. That's correct. And Chapter 8 pretty well lays out that, for any, well, not for any, but for those CalFed projects, principally Los Vaqueros, Sites, and Temperance, 50% of the capital costs that would be associated with those projects would be available through $3 billion, which were allocated in the water bond to be allocated for public benefits, of which there are 5 categories. And those categories are currently being defined by the California Water Commission in terms of providing some weight factor of how to allocate that funds. And then the other 50% would be basically the beneficiary costs. Whoever receives that water, then they have to come up with the money. We've always accepted that. That's the way we developed Chapter 8.
That doesn't sound like local interest proponents on a project are offering to pay half the cost themselves. It sounds like you agree the public ought to pay at least half the cost, but you have not identified the users that will pay the other half.
Or the beneficiaries. The beneficiaries is who I'm saying. The water users would pay the other 50%. Whoever is part of receiving some proportion of the yield, of the new yield coming out of that project, would be responsible for covering that other 50%.
Why isn't it possible to put that deal together right now and walk into the state and say, here's our half share, you pony up the rest?
Sure.
I mean, because right now the discussions on the big projects are truly theoretical, except we've spent over a decade on each trying to evaluate the environmental consequences, and there is a lingering suspicion that the financial local share is not there. Well, that may be wrong, but in the absence of a hard, cold offer to match payments from responsible entities, how else do we deal with it?
No, that's understandable. And I can't speak for any other project other than the project that I represent, and that's Temperance Flat, or the Front Division. And I'm just going to reiterate what was mentioned a little bit earlier, is that where we're at is we're waiting for the feasibility study to be done, which will be done sometime in December or January. That in itself will tell us the feasibility of Temperance Flat, which will tell us the yield, will tell us the cost, will tell us any operational considerations. It basically is going to tell us what we're going to be buying. And until we know what we're going to be buying, it's hard to get somebody to sign up to pay for the dam. We've got people that are interested, but they're not going to sign anything until they know what they're going to buy. I can tell you this, is that because this project will have both state money and federal money, along with beneficiary money, it's a different project than what we have today. Today, the Front Division is a federal project, but you can't bring state money into a project and not be a different project. So we have been talking to a variety of entities beyond the existing federal contractors. Could be the tribal councils that are in that area, the cities that currently do not receive water from that area, West Side contractors who we might get involved in this so that we can exchange waters to make their life easier on the West Side. There's a variety of people, and it also includes discussions that will be happening with Southern California, because I have not mentioned the more viable way that we should be pursuing storage, and that is what I call integrated operations. Integrated operations needs to be the way we operate in the future. To date, we've been focused on operating reservoirs to provide strictly regional benefits. And from my perspective, those days are gone. We now need to figure out how do we operate all reservoirs in some fashion that helps each other depending on the set of circumstances that exist during any given year. We've been pursuing that discussion heavily because San Luis Reservoir, who is the only major downstream storage from the Delta, is pretty important, and it itself experiences conditions that reduce the availability of water south of the Delta. Temperance Flat, and this is one of the points I want to make to Randy because I read your report, and you make one correct statement there regarding basically that both sites and Temperance are both considered above Delta. That's correct. But to add to that, Temperance Flat is not only considered above the Delta, it's the only reservoir that's considered above and below the Delta. Pretty important fact, because not only can we provide water to the Delta to help the Delta, but we can deliver water and bring it across and deliver it south. So for purposes of both integrated operations with San Luis Reservoir, where we can move water east and west to optimize wet water conditions and to have water to move for emergency purposes should we ever have a Delta failure. It's the only reservoir that can do it. What I'm saying is Temperance Flat or any other reservoir in the state needs to be looked at in terms of how do you integrate it with any other reservoir for a better state operation rather than just a regional benefit.
Mr. Johnston.
What would be the benefit to the Delta if Temperance is constructed?
I'm glad you asked that question because, again, Temperance is considered above the Delta, and the reason it's considered above the Delta is because when it releases its water, it moves northerly to the Delta. So having Temperance, which is in essence increasing the cup that you have to store wet water, and again, I'm going to remind you that we've lost 14 million acre feet during flood flows, which benefit nobody. But if you kept that same volume of water, that allows us to have a more continuous flow over time through the San Joaquin River, which already has...
Would there be more water in the river, particularly in the drier months?
Great. That's a good question because in our settlement, there are 6 different type years. In the 2 lowest or driest years, there's the very driest year, there is really no water that goes into the river that makes it to the Delta. It's probably not until you get to the 3rd type where it actually makes it to the Delta. So if we had the larger cup, we would have more water available to have more continuous flow during the dry years and have that conductivity.
So, for instance, what you referenced in the proposed bond, the public benefits that would justify the expenditure of bond funds to match the project, would those then ensure flows consistent with that agreement you already have, or would it be a different agreement?
I think what it would do is it would enhance what we already have in our agreement. You got to keep in mind this.
But the agreement you have, you said that in 2 of those 6 conditions,
right,
no water flows anyway.
That's correct.
So would water flow in all 6 conditions, even the driest years, if Temperance was built?
What would happen, at least the way I would see it, is that if we were able to have that additional yield, it would allow the restoration program to decide, if they wanted to get some of that water.
But you'd expect them to pay for that water.
I think that there would have to be some compensation for
Okay,
that.
so what you want is the public to pay up front the cost of construction on a cost share and to pay in addition for the water that results from the construction.
No, because the partnership or it is not money that's coming out of the public. The bulk of the dollars in the restoration are dollars from the Friant Water Users Authority.
Well,
I know
just to take a moment, because sure, I listened to your history, and farmers pumped water from the ground and irrigated crops and depleted the groundwater basin. The federal project, at the behest of those farmers, created Friant Dam and therefore diverted large portions of the San Joaquin River so that it essentially runs out well before it gets to the delta in the summertime. So the water has been diverted out of the river to solve one problem, and that is the depletion of the underground water basin, and by substituting surface water permits farmers to prosper. But the delta lost the flow of the San Joaquin River, except in the winter and spring, but not in the summer and fall. Eventually, a settlement was reached, and that settlement requires, in effect, the farmers, the Friant users, to part with some of the water they diverted, and you suggested about 20%, in order to put back in the river that which they took. You said there was a price, and the price was the loss of the water.
There's two prices. There's one 20% loss of the water supply we have, and then there's $1 billion that we have to invest in physical changes into the river.
Right.
And so the commitment is to deliver water to the Merced confluence, not to the delta, but to the Merced confluence.
Which is why the river still runs out of water.
Yeah.
Right. In Merced County, it runs out now.
Yeah, sure.
My colleagues can be really hard on panelists. I want to point out that Mario represents the upper San Joaquin River, and as he pointed out, the reservoir, Friant Reservoir, is really undersized to service the 1 million acres that reservoir is designed to service. So as you move down the Friant Kern Canal, you pass Pine Flat, you pass Cahuilla, you pass Success, you pass Lake Isabella, that are all smaller reservoirs that are also contributing to surface water supply to offset groundwater overdrafts along the east side of the San Joaquin Valley. You can't expect Friant to support all of that area and provide adequate flows in the San Joaquin River. And when this was all designed in the 1950s, we really, as a society, didn't care much whether that reservoir dried up the river or not. Now we do. And that's the important point to keep in mind, why we need more storage to supplement the new societal values for in-stream flows in support of the fisheries.
Thank you. Well said. So, my lack of knowledge, pins more responsibility on Friant than should be. But on the policy issue, waters that otherwise flowed to the Delta were diverted for economic benefit. And then in later years, it's true there's a price, certainly to all those current property owners and farmers, to have to pay or to lose water, and the implications of that, in order for some of that water to now go to the Delta. But the big price paid to the Delta and to the environment was the one in the 50s that diverted the water. So if you now say, well, how can we improve it, both for the farmers who have to share some of their water and improve it for the Delta, Temperance Flat or those kind of projects could do that. Does the cost of that improvement to the Delta fall only on the public side, that is the state side of payment, or do those who have economically benefited for 60 years and continue to benefit have a responsibility for paying half that cost?
Well, again, I would reiterate what Councilmember Ferrini said. If you stop and take a look at the history of California, because the situation of Friant is not singular, okay? If you take a look at Hitchhatchee, which took water, diverted water out of the San Joaquin River and then sent it through a pipe system to San Francisco, which it still does today, it does not dedicate any water into the San Joaquin River. There's no dedication back in stream to the San Joaquin River, so it continues to send its water there. Now, is that right? That's wrong. Those are decisions, and that's just another example. But there's a number of those same examples. It was a societal.
Well, let's take that as an example. I think that's a good example. So, as Mr. Shabatani suggested, maybe we could have high elevation reservoirs in some places. I'm not sure that's a reservoir a system that could take it. But let's say, for the sake of argument, above Hetch Hetchy, you could do a project, right? And that project was a project of San Francisco because it could get more hydro power money, and so they wanted to do it. Wouldn't the state's interests come into play there because of exactly what you said, that in the early part of the 20th century, all that water was diverted away from the Delta, and there's been a harm to the Delta, and that if they wanted to do something else that either enhanced their water supply or made them more money, wouldn't it be reasonable for the state to require a payment to improve the Delta?
Rather,
I was trying to figure out who the question was for. Was it for me?
No, it's for Randy.
Okay.
You want me to answer that? I think my colleagues at this table are better suited to answer that question. It's bigger than the question you asked. And I think the tension that exists in the San Joaquin Valley is one of insufficient surface water supplies, whether it's on the west side because of Delta conveyance or on the east side because of reservoirs like Lake Success and Isabella that can't operate at full capacity because of seismic issues, or Millerton that should have been a 2 million acre foot reservoir that's only 500,000 acre feet. The fact is that it's less costly for growers and urban areas, communities in those service areas to tap the groundwater than it is to build new surface water storage facilities to supplement their shortfalls. And there's a train on the tracks that's coming. And the Water Board is looking at increasing regulations on groundwater that, if it goes in a particular direction, will force locals to look more largely at and harder at surface water storage projects that will facilitate groundwater recharge projects. The two going
right. So your expert witnesses, and I'll stop because we got one more and we're running out of time, are really helpful in thinking through this. So thank you very much. But the reason for my questions are really to use that to get at what I think are policy issues that we have to think about, and particularly the financing. And so Randy's report is very good, and the tendency or the increase of storage is a worthy goal that should be supported and we should pursue. What I want to do is not defer to some other time, who the beneficiaries are, and not ignore the history, and not ignore the fact that did people mindlessly mine the underground, or it was just a function of capitalism run rampant? You just take all the water, and when you run out, you move away or die or something. I don't know what happened, but the state's interest,
right,
in law is to help restore the delta. So these projects have to do that. It's not like the last thing, and maybe when we get to it, condition 5 or 6 might get met if everybody else gets all the water they want. I want it baked into the cake up front.
Yeah, what I would tell you is this, is that before a project like Friant got built, or before the state water project got built, it goes through a whole lot of process. And in those days, it was actually the state of California that wanted to do this project, because they was looking at how to create an economy in that area. And so the picture was bigger than just a few farmers wanting water. It was the state of California that wanted actually to do it, had to hand off the baton to the federal government to actually implement it. And there were decisions that were made by the State Resources Control Board, who looked at the fact that if by diverting that water to create this economy, there was going to be a consequence, and that consequence was going to be a dryness of a river. At that time, California said, that's our goal. This is more important than that. Was that right? Was it wrong? I can't tell you, but that was the decision California made then. Today's a different day, so now we have to meet some new objectives. So I'm telling you that this project, from, let's say, the council's perspective, should be focused on what can a project like that do to improve the delta conditions and reliability.
I go back to Mr. Fiorini's draft. He manages successfully to say, complete the studies on these large projects, which keeps hope alive, but actually allows us to open up the debate on storage in smaller projects where the cost sharing is up front, where the public interest is identified and the public benefit is identified. And it's that, I think that's part of the genius of this conceptual approach, not the details, the conceptual approach. It doesn't require us to answer the 160-year-old historic questions, which essentially are expressed in whatever else you do to help somebody else, you have to guarantee that nothing changes for me ever, and somebody pays some abstract guy behind the tree pays the cost for everything. That's, the temperance discussion is in very many ways what has prevented any rational discussion of smaller projects for 15 to 20 years. Not just Temperance, but others comparably situated. We've managed to mess it all up. We now all know we have to reevaluate it, and everyone mucks around trying to find a way out of it. That's the reason that Randy's proposal is attractive to me. It offers a slightly different approach to get us into actions that might cumulatively benefit society as a whole and the individuals who live in it, not just rehashing the old agreements that have been around for a while. It doesn't do injustice to whatever arguments exist on Temperance, and of course, as you might imagine, I'm more inclined to your analysis of the situation than not. But the genius is, storage is part of everybody's solution for the future, properly done. And that's also why I think the ingredient here of identifying a cost-sharing requirement and putting that up front, not just the hopes of one. So it's not like I used to feel, land developers come in, gee, rezone this property. Finance is not a problem. As soon as I have the rezoning, I'll walk out the door and get it. There are at least 3 hotels that have never been built where we honored that agreement. Mr. Manley, but
I don't want you guys to think that there is not that requirement. In Chapter 8, we specifically put in the condition that before it can be considered for funding, we have to have like 75% of all the financial commitments in place. So there is no easy road to get this thing done. Now, I didn't give any recommendations because there were so many questions, so I'd like to at least give a couple recommendations.
Fast, please.
Okay, all right. Well, basically one is I think that this is an important document. I would emphasize, though, that it maybe could get characterized as that storage as a whole is important, whether it's small, whether it's above, whether it's underground. As a whole, it's important. That's an important message to send out. I think the fact that the Water Commission is working on the public benefits regulations, which will help figure out how to distribute money, I think that needs to get done. So a message to the governor saying, get that done, would be a good message. Secondly, I think that, because I'm on the advisory committee for the California Water Plan 2013, I think you need to send a strong message to them that storage in all categories, above, below, and so forth, needs to be a strategy tool identified in that document, because I work with legislators. They need to see it in there so it helps facilitate them moving forward with funding of storage. And so I'd like to see that happen. The other thing that I would caution or maybe suggest that the appropriate wordage go in there is, because I've seen the effort it takes, and I don't want to go backwards. So in doing the assessment of smaller projects, if you're going to go back and revisit the ones that were done for, like, say, Temperance, there was 22 sites. That's okay. But let's make sure that going back and revisiting them doesn't reset the clock all over again to move the big project forward. So however you do that, let's make sure that we are not hindering the forward movement of big ones in going back and assessing little ones. I think you should, but we need to find a way that it is not counterproductive to the big ones.
Mr. Manley.